Now, adding and taking are sort of like opposites of each other, and timesing and dividing are sort of like opposites of each other. If one does, then the other can undo. Adding to and taking to are opposite things. One will do and the other will undo. Timesing by 10 and dividing by 10, one will do and the other will undo. With any kind of maths thing that we might do, with any kind of thing we could work out, it's helpful to have a way of reversing it, of doing the opposite to get back to where we started. And powers are no different. Consider something like this. 6 squared equals 36. We're going to stick with the square numbers for this. 6 squared, 6 times 6 is 36. But what if I said to you, here is 36. What number did I square to get 36? Now, if you knew that was a square number, then okay, you could count up through your square numbers. But we still need a way of showing that kind of opposite thing, of giving it a name, of giving that reverse operation an identity of its own, of saying, if we start with 36, what number did we square to get 36? And that reverse operation is called the square root. And it is written like a kind of tick with the number inside. This symbol, this kind of tick with the number inside, is the square root. And this says the square root of 36. And the square root means what number did we square, what number did we times by itself to give us the number inside the square root, in this case 36. And that number must have been 6, because 6 times 6 is 36. To consider some other square roots, for example, 9 squared is 81, so the square root of 81 says what number did we square to get the 81, what number did we times by itself? Well, that must be 9. 5 squared is 25, so the square root of 25 must be 5. Because 5 times 5 is 25, so the number that we squared to get the 25 must be 5. Now we can take the square root of anything that we like. Any number in the world will have a square root. Only the square numbers will give us whole number square roots. Why? Because that's what the square numbers are. The square numbers are the results of squaring the whole numbers. Taking those whole numbers, timesing them by themselves, and seeing what we get. Because the square numbers are generated from whole numbers, then the square roots of the square numbers will give us those whole numbers back again. But we can take the square root of anything that we like. And to do that, we'll need a calculator. Work out the square root of 55. Now 55 is not a square number. 55 was not on that list of square numbers. We had 49, we had 64, but we did not have 55. Which means the answer to this is not going to be a whole number. Only the square numbers will give us whole number square roots. But 55 will have a square root. There is a number that when we times it by itself, we get 55. And that number will be the answer to the square root of 55. That's what the square root is trying to find. It's saying what number did we times by itself to get the 55. To do that, we use our calculator. Now, find your powers button on your calculator, whichever one of those buttons it was from before. And nearby there will be a button that looks like the square root. This is mine. It has the square root symbol and I have a blank box inside. Different calculators may have it look slightly different, but they will all show the square root symbol. It might just be the square root tick. There are two ways that your calculator might use the square root button. It will either be the square root button, then the number, and press equals, or it will be the number and then the square root button. And you'll need to find out which one of those it is. To do that, let's test it with one of the ones that we're expecting an answer from. So we've already seen that the square root of 36 is 6. What I need to do on mine is I need to press the square root button, and then I need to type the 36 and press equals, and that returns 6 as an answer. It is possible that on your calculator you might have to do it the other way around. So you might have to type the 36 first and then press the square root button. But test on your calculator which way round you need to do it. If you get the 6, then that's the way round you need to go. This one then, for example, now we know how our calculator works. Work out the square root of 55, so on mine, square root button, and then 55, and then press equals. And it's returned the same thing. Now that's a problem, isn't it? No, it isn't. All it is another example of my calculator giving me the answer in the neatest way possible. And the calculator has looked at this and said, oh, it's such a mucky decimal that we're just going to return the neatest way possible. And that's leaving it as a square root unworked out. To change it, I just need to press this S to D button again. Your calculator might have just given you this decimal answer already, in which case great. If it doesn't, the S to D button, remember, switches between the different forms on your calculator, and I'm going to press that, like I did, to switch between the different forms and generate this decimal, because this is the one that we're interested in. And our answer then is going to be 7.416198487, which the question might have wanted us to do some stuff with. It is possible that the question might have wanted us to round that perhaps, or give it to a certain number of significant figures, or it might just want us to write down everything on the calculator display. If it wants you to round it, I would strongly suggest you write down everything on your calculator display first, like I have done, and then round it. Give another line and round it to whatever you need to round it to. But the question might just want you to write down everything in your calculator display, in which case it might well tell you to do that. So only round if you need to, and if you need to, then round. Find an estimate for the value of the square root of 30. Keyword in this question is that word estimate. You might be tempted to just put the square root of 30 in your calculator, press equals, and find an exact value for it. Write down whatever decimal the answer comes out as. It's clearly going to be a decimal because 30 is not a square number. The only square roots that return whole number answers are square roots. This is not a square number. If you did that though and you wrote down the answer from your calculator, you would get 0 marks because the question specifically says find an estimate for the value of square root of 30. So no calculators are allowed in this question. We have to be able to do this without a calculator. And in fact it's an estimate, so we're going to do that anyway. What we are going to do though is we are going to use square numbers to help us. We're going to consider some square numbers that are nearby, some facts that we already know. We're going to very much use what we know to find something we don't. Now we possibly already know that 5 squared is 25, so the square root of 25 is 5. And we perhaps know that 6 squared is 36, so the square root of 36, asking what we squared to get that number, the square root of 36 would be 6. And these are the key things here, this bit. The square root of 25 is 5, and the square root of 36 is 6. We are not interested in 25 or 36 though, we are interested in the square root of 30. But 30 is interesting. 30 falls between 25 and 36. In fact, 30 falls roughly halfway between. It's 5 more than 25 and 6 less than 36. So the square root of 30, well, 30 is roughly halfway between 25 and 36. So we would expect the square root of 30 to be somewhere between the answers 5 and 6. In fact, we'd expect it to be roughly at that halfway point. If 30 is roughly halfway between 25 and 36, why would the answer to the square root not be halfway between 5 and 6? So surely a decent enough estimate would be 5.5. Now you might think, oh, but with estimates surely we want whole number answers. Well, yes we do. With these kind of questions though, and only these kind of questions, we make a bit of an exception. Because we know from our knowledge of square roots that the answer cannot be a whole number. It has to be a decimal. We limit ourselves to decimals of 1 decimal place. We don't go any more complicated than that because it is an estimate. It is just a rough answer. But we are saying here it cannot be a whole number because of this fact about square numbers, returning whole numbers when we square root them. It has to be a decimal, so we allow ourselves to have that kind of decimal guess. And we're saying 30 is halfway between 2 square numbers that we know, so the answer will be halfway between those 2 square roots. And we say 5.5 for an answer. We could just check it for ourselves on a calculator to make sure that that is a suitable estimate. You probably wouldn't have the chance to do this in an exam because this is likely to be a non-calculator question if it turns up, and I will say these do turn up fairly regularly. But while we've got the advantage of a calculator, we could work out the square root of 30 on our calculator. It's returned the square root of 30 again. It's given us that kind of neat form, but I could use the S to D button to switch it. 5.4772, and 5.4772 is close enough to 5.5, meaning that 5.5 seems like a sensible estimate. Find an estimate for the value of the square root of 68. We'll do another one of these because there's an important point to make about these kind of estimate answers that we're making. We're going to do the same thing again. We're going to choose a square number that's either side. Find out what values the answer must be sandwiched between. So the first thing we know that 8 squared is 64, so the square root of 64 must be 8. And we know that 9 squared is 81, so the square root of 81 must be 9. Now clearly, because 68 falls between 64 and 81, the square root of 68 is going to fall between the square roots of 64 and 81 as well. And the square root of 61 will be there, which means the answer must fall between 8 and 9. Problem is, it is not good enough to say 8.5 as an answer here. Why not? Well, because 68 is not roughly halfway between 64 and 81. 68 does fall between them, but it is clearly closer to the 64 than the 81. It's 4 away from 64 and 13 away from 81, which surely means that the answer to the square root is going to be closer to 8 than it is to 9. It's going to be less than that halfway mark at 8.5. It's going to be closer to the 8. But what do we go for? Well, we can just use our best judgment with this. Is 68 really close to 64? Well, no, it isn't. If it was really close, if it was like a 65, say, then we might say, well, the answer's going to be really close. We'll go for 8.1. But it's not that close. It's fairly close, but not really close. So maybe we'll go for something like an 8.2 or an 8.3. I'm going to go at 8.2. 8.3 will probably also get you the mark. 8.1, probably a little bit too close, because 68 isn't that close to 64. And 8.4, probably a little bit too big. We'd be going for that with something closer to the halfway point. 68, though, probably something like 8.2 or 8.3 would get you the mark. Fairly close, but not super close. Just since we have the calculator to check, let's check the square root of 68 and use S to D to turn it into something proper. 8.2462. So either 8.2 or 8.3 seem like sensible enough answers and would get us the mark.